I'm Joseph Bahout. I'm a political analyst, political scientist. I teach political science for a long time now in Paris, and I also have a research activity mainly in Carnegie, with Carnegie in Washington and now abroad. And I also work as a consultant mainly for the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In terms of long-term historical comparisons, I would say that what's happening today and in the region since 2010, 2011 is, without any doubt for me at least, something of a historical magnitude, like events, for example, like the crumbling of the Ottoman Empire, the formation of the states in the 20s, then maybe the post-Israeli creation period, post-48, the revolutions of the 50s, and now also it's a turning point in the history of the Arab world and in the region in general. Now for Lebanon, I think definitely it's something new, because it is maybe, and imperfectly, and it will take time, turning the page of something that has ended with the war, the post-war period, the Ta'if era. I think it was already very much scorched and wounded in 2005 with the assassination of Rafiq Hariri. Then we entered a kind of limbo period that is very difficult to define, because it was in Lebanon very fluctuant, and then you had the 2011 events in Syria that added to the fluctuation. And now with what's happening today in the streets in Lebanon and in the region also, I have the impression, it's maybe imperfect, it has to be refined, that we are turning this whole chapter. We are ending this whole chapter, entering in a chapter that is still to be written. We don't know nothing about it. It's very, let's say, flawed in terms of vision. It's very hazardous. We don't know exactly where we are going, but I think that definitely things are starting again.
You know, I like that I think you've pointed at every historic marker for this part of the world, from World War I up until today. So, and I like that you also included domestic calls for reform, including the You Stink movement not too long ago, a few years ago. But I want to get at maybe the crux of the issue. What is happening at the moment on the streets of Beirut? Do you sense that it's a yearning for political change, or is it simply an issue of economic stagnation and deterioration, where people are demanding something perhaps a lot simpler than a historical makeover?
In fact, it's all of the above and none of the above, because and this is why I was referring to what I call sedimentation, 2005 and then 2015, 16 and now, and maybe other episodes that I'm forgetting now. But if you take the 2005, it was almost only political. It was sovereignty, Lebanon first, and etc. It was completely political, and other issues were put aside, and sometimes maybe wrongly. 2015-16 was all social and not political. It was, we want better governance, we want better municipality management, we want waste management that is better. I think today it's the start of the blend of all this. And maybe this is why it's important and new, because it is starting to link macro-political issues and micro-political issues. None of these, of both, is enough to change things in a country, in a society. It's only when you link issues like macro-politics, regional and local, things like constitutional change and system change and etc. Things like day-to-day governance, economic mismanagement, corruption, day-to-day issues like internet speed, like traffic jam, like your garbage at home and etc. And things that are also very interesting in what's happening now in Beirut that are very cultural. A new way of expressing ourselves in the public space, this youngster phenomenon, the creativity, the artistic creativity, all this together, this entire spectrum of things, I think, is the explanation of why what's happening today is very important. Now, having said that, the fallback or the shortcoming of what's happening is that it is still not expressed enough. in terms of, let's say, political thematics, in terms of headlines, in terms of programmatic expression, and etc. And this has to do probably, and we will talk about it, I would like maybe to delve into that. It has to do with the sociology of the movement that is very diverse, which is good, but also that also could usher to some risk of fragmentation of the streets.
So I'm assuming here there's a stark difference between the momentum that led to March 14, 2005, where there was an upswell of emotion that led to a reconfiguration of sorts with leadership at the top. And they were very visible leadership that lasted years on. This time around, 3 months after the October revolt, 17th of October, I can't point to one name yet. Or I can't say that one name matters more than another name. And we can get into this a bit. I don't think October 17 was about getting Hassan Diab into power. So his name is not the name.
Definitely not.
And the potential lists of ministerial portfolios that was released, I don't know if any of those names even resonate among any protesters on the streets. So those are not the names that are meant to sort of transition into power. 3 months and potentially 4 months, and what could last months on end. Is the strength of the momentum curtailed without leadership? Or do you think the strength is that this is continuously fluid and you can't point the finger?
I think you're touching the crux of the issue. I mean, this is really the core question. I don't think that the prior reason for, let's say now, this kind of fatigue that we are witnessing in the movement is due to the leaderless aspect or the faceless aspect or the nameless aspect of it, although it is something that has to be tackled at one point. Now, when you refer to March 14 of 2005, what's interesting today, and maybe what I will say is a bit provocative, what the main difference, and for me this is why it's much more important, is that most of the figures that were produced by March 14 are today also contested, and this is the meaning of the slogan "Kullun yani kullun." All means all is a way of let's put it this way, to go beyond March 14th and March 8th, and this is, I think, the importance of the moment. It's really the getting beyond the divide and the cleavage that was inherited. Now, there's a caveat here and a footnote that we have to tackle, which is the Shia issue, because in a way, after the first 2 weeks, the Shia public, let's say, was put aside from the protest very smartly by Hezbollah and by Hassan Nasrallah. We'll get back to that. But now, is the movement going nowhere because it doesn't have a prominent figure to put on the table, a prominent leader or a set of leaders, and etc.? Here also we have to go for some comparison with what's happening in the Arab world. I mean, if you look at today the revolutions that we call in our jargon the Arab revolutions 2.0, the new ones, meaning Algeria, Sudan, Iraq, Egypt at some point, and etc., and Lebanon, they are all very much leaderless and faceless and unorganized willingly. Yes. Now, it has to do with this fear of being co-opted, of being decapitated by the power. This is a partial explanation. I think something more interesting and more fascinating is that these protest movement don't want to replicate and to imitate and to resemble anything the state they are contesting is about, which is a kind of deep contradiction. They want to replace the state, but they don't want to be like the state. In fact, in French, we have a very interesting word for that. We call these revolution dégagisme, meaning follow. This is the main slogan. Yes. Leave, please. Yes. Pack up and leave. But we are not saying, or these people, these protest movements are not saying, leave, we want to replace you. Leave, and then we want other people more maybe technocratic, more efficient, more etc. to replace you, which is, I think, the beginning of the impasse politically. Because when you say leave and we want people who are purely technocratic, purely technicians to replace you, we are putting politics outside the realm. And this is where I think there's a a kind of contradiction in the movement. The movement has to assume and to take in charge the political aspect of things, even though it doesn't want to organize and to grant itself leaders and etc. But it can't say we are only there to say that we don't want this and that, but we don't want to get into the issue. We only want to be influencers, we only want to be protesters, and this is where I think politics will have to be brought in again in this movement. Politics in the classical way, although it doesn't please most of the young protesters because culturally they come from elsewhere. Maybe what I'm saying is very much attached to my generation and the way we are used to do things politically, i.e. to organize, to have a political bureau, to talk like all chunks, but this is the way we do things. And if we want to replace this power with something functional, at one point we'll have to get into that. Now, probably there are new ways to do that, which are alien to us, our generation. This young generation has maybe means to do this that are new and alien to us. We have to learn them.
Are you talking more about technology?
Yeah, the technology, the way to organize, the way to be more horizontal, as they say, and refuse hierarchy. Maybe. I respect that and I admire that. And anyway, this fascinates me. But at one point, when you want to do politics, there are political ways that exist since thousands of years. I mean, you won't escape that.
Sure, and an inevitability of some form of election will require
election,
some form of
leadership, programmatic expression, clarification of some points, and etc. Now, this unclarification is useful because now it helps the movement to keep on and to keep the momentum, because once they get into details, friction and fractionalization will begin. Now, and this is normal also.
Yeah, but I want to go back just a bit towards the what perhaps at least triggered the momentum behind what we're seeing. Would you put, you said it in a way that it's all encompassing, meaning that people want political change, they want economic change, and they want, I think, decency at the end of the day.
Normalcy and decency.
Normalcy and something where they can bet on the future rather than reluctantly deal with the present. Do you put any weight on the economic breakdown as at least the core unifying issue? And what I'm asking here is remove the economic decline, stabilize the lira. Would you sense that all these protesters would remain on the street chanting, wanting something better, according to what you've described, which is really a new stage, a new chapter? Or is it really about economics, and that when there's no money in this country, people do resort to demonstrations and they stay on the streets? And I ask only because it seems like the build-up to October 17 was less reform on the power sharing level and more to do with just pain, genuine pain. And I'm just curious about that. Is the pain the requirement for these protesters to continue? And if you alleviate it, will they go home?
Two or three things. First, I think that my fear, and this is a fear, and I probably am wrong, and maybe in the future I'll be proven wrong, but if the economic / painful level of things is away, I'm afraid that the old political cleavages will pop up and resurface again. March 8, March 14, Syria, Iran, Hezbollah, the resistance, Lebanon first, all these slogans that are still there, looming around. They are in the street. What is fascinating in the street now, if you go there, is that you have both publics. You have people who come from a kind of resistance culture and people who come from a sovereignty culture, sovereignist culture, and etc. They are there because of the mismanagement, the economic pain, the crisis, and etc. So this is one question.
And they're all impacted the same way.
So this is why starting to talk politics, and this is what I was exactly saying before, starting to talk politics really, to put things on paper, ideas, programs, when they say we want to the fall of the Nizam, we want Yasqut al-Nizam, replace it with what is something that we have to start thinking about if we don't want to fall again in the old cleavages. Once the economic issue is away, and it won't be away soon. This is point one. Point two, what's interesting is that the economic malaise that has been piling up for years and maybe for decades was the trigger of this. But then, when all this started, the economic collapse, and it's not anymore a crisis, it's a collapse, has become the main actor of the crisis. Today, I think the strongest actor in Lebanon is neither the Ahad or Hezbollah or the street or the opposition or Hariri or...
It's the lira. It's
the lira as an incarnation, as a symbol of the economic collapse.
Absolutely.
I think the economic collapse and the pace it will take very quickly as of now will be the main actor. And this actor doesn't have a political preference. It's neither with Iran nor with the US, neither with Aoun or with Gibran Bassil or with Hariri or with... It is a macroeconomic dynamics that doesn't ask anyone about its opinion. So it will happen and it will be painful. Which leads me to point three, just to finish on that. My fear also is that once this happens, we will not be anymore talking about classical politics, because once we are in the full collapse, and we are heading towards that, unfortunately, so far, if nothing changes. And this collapse will be really nightmarish. I mean, it won't be something nice. It won't be anymore the revolt or the protest of middle-class youngsters in Saht al-Shuhada. It will be very awful. I mean, you will see, it will be the revolution of the Hungary.
Absolutely.
And this will take and put us in a different picture. This is where a political question will open that is very anguishing. Who will benefit from that? Hezbollah can benefit from that if it plays it populist. The army can benefit of that because it will play on the security phobia. Other forces could play with it, or we can easily get into a Congolese scenario. I mean, really slide toward open violence, unending violence, and etc. And this is the nightmarish scenario. This is why also there is a need to become political, to start becoming political, in order to reap this moment. That will happen. This moment is not a choice. It will happen. And if the movement is not enough, doesn't start to structure itself enough, it will be, let's say, dépassé by or swept over by this revolution of the Hungary, which will have a completely different software. It won't ask people anymore about their cultural preference, their political preference, etc. You will be faced with a scene where really very populist slogans will be on the table, slogans like we want to nationalize the banks, we want to break the houses of the rich people. You know, this kind of cultural phenomenon that is completely understandable in such a circumstance. But at that moment, I think that the nice and rosy picture of the protest will be over. It will be put aside, and most of the people in the street will also be frightened by what will happen. And this is where the sociological diversity of the movement that is interesting and is an asset by itself will become maybe a liability.
And anarchy is a threat to the ruling class by default.
Exactly. And this is why part of the movement, and here I'm saying things that will not please some people, part of the movement, the radical part, let's say, is betting on that openly. I mean, you can see it on social media and Facebook and elsewhere. They are betting on the collapse by saying, okay, once the collapse will occur, all this classical game will be swept away and new rules will be established. The question is, for these people, are you up to these new rules or not? And who will be, let's say, the prominent player at that point? And this frightens some... Let's say the middle-class bourgeoisie part of the movement, what in Egypt we call Hizb al-Kanabaya. I mean, people who are, in fact, just want change, but they don't want, let's say, revolutionary change or chaotic change or etc.
I want to ask you, since in a way, you've been able to watch this from abroad while you were in Paris, and you've also been here for parts of it, and you provided input to the economic emergency reform paper. And I hope you don't mind me saying this, that there is an updated version that could be released soon. So that's an economic sort of focused paper. But you've also watched the political changes that have happened. And I want your opinion on the center of power that is perhaps betting on the revolution to go away. And I want to gauge you on this. Do you sense that the momentum, and I mean the average protester, today a little more afraid of going to the street, or perhaps less willing to confront, is a byproduct of Hezbollah's indirect sort of pressure to have this simply just disappear? And what I'm asking here is, do you think that what we've seen happening the last 3 months is a consequence of Hezbollah's perhaps fear that this revolution could also spell something bad for them?
Definitely, this is a factor that has played in the phobia, the paranoia of Iran and its proxies and Hezbollah in Lebanon about what's happening in Iraq, Iran, Lebanon at the same time, and now the killing of Soleimani that has added a very complicated factor to all this is definitely something. But I think it's much deeper and much graver than that. And you touched the point. You are nailing a very important point. Look, if we put it simplistically, it's been now almost 80 days since it started. I think that now we are at the end of the second set of the match. The first set was won by the protest.
That's nice. So how many sets are there for this match? 6?
5 usually. No, I don't know. You can change the rules also.
Yes.
Yeah. So the first set was won by the street in the sense that the power was groggy. The power structure was groggy for a while. They didn't understand what happened. I mean, all the power structure.
Yeah.
All of them.
Yeah.
So they took the blow, and then they took time to realize what's happening and etc. Set 2, I think, my fear is that it has been won by the power structure. Mm-hmm. The naming of Hassan Diab, the fact that the movement is withering away slowly, but I'm sure it's not given for long. But this is phase 2. Now, let me say a few words on this phase 2, and this is what you exactly were saying. The Hezbollah factor was one of this. But I think that if we also take the metaphor of other revolutions that are happening in the country, in the region, you have this tremendous force of what we call the counter-revolution. Mm-hmm. And counter-revolution is not only a security structure or a political structure, it's a political culture that is in the region that plays on several things. Hezbollah plays on the fear of the plot, of the American plot to break the resistance axis. Okay, it plays a role. And then you have the fear of the economic collapse.
Right.
The Parti de l'Ordre, as we call it, or Hezb al-Kanabaya, the order party, of people who are saying, okay, we want a better governance, we want a better day-to-day living, but in fact, we don't want to rock the boat. We don't want to see banks closing, and because most of them are working in the system. They are lawyers, they are bankers, they are middle-class people, and etc. And then you have the third aspect of the third, let's say, ammunition, or the third factor, or the third, let's say, ingredient of counter-revolution, that is fatigue. And this is where time is important, and structuration of the movement becomes important. Right. And then you have the economic crisis, this actor that no one is taking into account enough yet. Right. And all these ingredients have fabricated the counter-revolution. So Hezbollah has played its role on the Shia part of it. Mm-hmm. So they have, I think, dried up the Shia street for its majority, and then they have alluded to and given some hints that they could use violence. But we haven't been into violence like in Iraq or in Iran, where you have thousands of deaths. They didn't have to do that in Lebanon. Only the shade of it was enough to already frighten certain people in the street. And then you have the other aspects that are the economic fatigue and time. This is where Lebanon is different from Iraq and elsewhere, because the economic fatigue and the economic collapse is much stronger. We don't have that in Iraq or in Algeria, who are in fact rich countries, oil countries where you have wealth and etc. They don't need money from the IMF and etc. Lebanon is a wealthy country also, but its wealth has been completely evaporated by the dominant class that is both political and economic, we have to say. So the counter-revolution is something that is much more sophisticated than only Hezbollah frightening people in the street. And I will add something that maybe also will not please certain people. The last episode of what we have lived after the Hariri ousting from power, he ousted himself. Also, he played the counter-revolution. The fact that Saad Hariri, for example, uses so extensively the Sunni street for only a sectarian, let's say, cause that, okay, they stole the prime ministership from me, I want it back, and etc., is not something that is helping very much the protest, and it is fueling the counter-revolution. Because ultimately, and this is maybe part of your question, Hezbollah would love to see the landscape in Lebanon back to something like March 14 and March 8. This is the habitat. It is very much at ease because it will say, okay, this is a classical game we've been living since 2005. This is a plot to break us and etc. Go back to your own street. We have our own street and etc. So we are replicating the same game again. This is why the revolution was very clever in putting first and foremost the slogan of Kul Kun Yani Kul Kun.
Absolutely.
To say Hariri and others, you are all the same for us, and don't play on us, or don't, let's say, ride the wave of the street in order to get to your own aims. But all this is the counter-revolution. At one point, you can't rule out that Hariri will maybe make a new deal with Hezbollah and on and rule again. And so the street has to stick to its slogan of Kul Kun Yani Kul Kun and avoid anything that could resemble the old cleavage, because I think the old cleavage is one of the features of the counter-revolution. So it's a way of answering you. So Hezbollah plays its role in this, but it plays part of the script. It's not the entire script. All others are playing. I think the entire political class would at some point collude together in order to kill this revolt and this protest, by using sometimes their own contradictions, because they know that their own contradictions, if they swallow people in them again, they will be enough, or they will be a guarantee that the protest will die and stop.
I mean, it is clear the last few years prior to these protests that there was a marriage of convenience among several groupings, and it lined up more on Hezbollah's terms than perhaps 10 years ago or even 15. But now, is it foreseeable that a protest movement that, let's say, does what you're describing, which is organizes to a degree and has some political power and potentially sees itself in elections, can you imagine Hezbollah able to accommodate that kind of momentum? And what I'm asking here is, it almost seems like there's an inevitable wall that even if the most decent demands are fought for, they tend to get, in a way, curtailed and oftentimes killed because of the way this country has handled a group like Hezbollah the last, maybe since Taif. And I'm curious, just, is there any room for hope so long as there's an armed group that is able to maybe influence things, whether it's soft intimidation or hard intimidation?
So far, unfortunately, you're completely right. So far, this is it. But I wouldn't put, let's say, the only reason for that on the existence of Hezbollah as an armed group. This is very important. But look, we are talking today, you and me, 3 days after the killing of Qasem Soleiman.
Right.
Something like that is not done by Hezbollah, it's done by the nemesis of Hezbollah, I think has very much crippled the dynamics of the revolution, of the street. Because now, and yesterday Hassan Nasrallah was very clear by saying that, saying regardless of small Lebanese details, now, after this killing, It's clear, either you are with us or you are against us. So if in the street you are saying, I'm against the power structure in Lebanon, within which Hezbollah is, and this power structure is protected by Hezbollah and wanted by Hezbollah because it serves its interests and etc. But I don't want to talk about the weapons of Hezbollah because it's not the matter now. Hezbollah will answer you, okay, fine, it's nice what you say, but in fact now gloves are off, it's either with us or against us. So in a way, if I want to put it simply, I would say that the killing of Soleimani doesn't lend a service to the revolution. It's not something positive. It's not that we have to take a position for or against and good riddance with Qasem Soleimani, but it doesn't serve because now if you are saying we want the fall of this system and etc., Hezbollah will tell you, yeah, okay, so you are willingly or not, stupid, naively or not, you are part of this adventure that is trying to break Iran and the axis of resistance and etc. So this is why I would have done easily without this assassination in Iraq, although it is maybe a game changer on the global scene, on the regional scene, but on the domestic scene, and this is where the revolution has to be politically smart and clever, not to get into that, neither with nor against. I mean, this is not our issue. I mean, fine, we all have our opinion. I mean, the street should say every one of the protesters has its own opinion about Qasem Soleimani, but we are still considering that Hezbollah in Lebanon is protecting a corrupt and inefficient system, regardless of its regional policies. Because in fact, what is happening elsewhere in the Arab world doesn't have anything to do with Hezbollah in Algeria or etc., for example, and also the economic system that we are contesting in Lebanon and that has now reached its kind of lethal end has not started because or with Hezbollah. It has started because we made wrong choices in the 90s about the political economy. It's something very structural. Of course, Hezbollah was part of that. Syria was part of that because part of the corruption in the 90s and the 2000s was very much linked to the Syrian Lebanese economic mafia and financial mafia. But it's not only that. There is something that is purely Lebanese into that and that we have to confront. And I think that, and I agree with you, I fully agree with you, every event contributes to building this wall that the Lebanese are hitting every time they are trying to change. Because every time you are trying to talk about your day-to-day life, your small issues, your reality, in fact, you are confronted to big issues that are not forcibly something of your concern. And you are forced to take a position on that. Are you against or with that? Look, I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about my electricity, my taxation system, my banking system. But the system answers you with, no, but you have to tell me, are you with me or against me?
Where domestic becomes geopolitical even when you're not talking about regional stuff.
Exactly. You are sunk into that. You are sucked into that.
Now, I like what you said earlier about Lebanon being almost entirely non-violent story the last few months. If I'm not mistaken, only one protester was killed. And that is remarkable.
Exactly.
Iraq, and you said it, thousands. Iran, potentially thousands as well. In Syria, the number is endless, regardless of what has happened. But that is quite astonishing. If the protesters are to continue what we see the last few days, where there's I don't want to call it violence, because it's not traditional violence, but there is a level of intolerance, I think, that things are not changing fast enough. And you see banks being attacked. You see things that are startling, where the system, and I don't mean the political system, I mean the basic economic, what's left of it, is crippled. Is there a way to enact decent demands for change in Lebanon without taking those steps and endangering what's left of the financial sector, what's perhaps breaking and burning things? And
look, within limits, I don't think there's any protest movement or revolutionary, let's say, dynamics or phenomenon that is completely violence-free. Okay, even the Gilets jaunes in France and etc. You have some doses of violence. This is not what worries me, but what you say, what you describe, and this is exactly what I had in mind when I talked about the next step of the crisis, when the economic system will collapse and not only be in crisis, and you will have this revolution of the hungry. This is exactly the videos that are circulating now on social media. It's the avant-goût. It's the shade of it. It's the appetizer of it. It's what you see in Halba, in some banks, or sometimes elsewhere, is what I'm afraid of having as the main scene, not only the sideshow today.
Yes.
And this is where I think the revolution should start thinking seriously about this step, because we're heading towards that. So, of course, some violence will. I mean, look, there are certain small-scale violences that are, I think, interesting and nice and positive. For example, I'm taking a very immediate example. Yesterday, the ousting of a political figure from a restaurant in Beirut.
This is the most, that to me is
or
the
another one from AUB. Okay, this is
yeah.
violence. We can say this is symbolic violence, but this is good. This is a way of mobilizing people, of also, because we don't have to be naive, Ronnie. I mean, these people that the street is contesting are dinosaurs. I mean, they won't easily feel the heat, and this will replicate and this will be repeated. Will when we talk about attacking today banks, tomorrow maybe storming supermarkets, maybe storming houses, I mean, people will stop you in the street, will take your car, will take your wallet, and except this is something else.
That's 1970s
again.
That's,
and it's not only in Lebanon. You know, just to give you an anecdotal example, I was in Bogota a year ago, invited by the Lebanese community for a lecture, and then all the people who came and to pick me up from the hotel, all these young people, Lebanese people from third generation, had armored cars. And at one point I said, why are you why are you driving these cars? And they told me now everything is fine, but 5 years ago, 10 years ago, we couldn't move in Bogota without a bodyguard and an armored car, because people would stop you just to take your money.
Right.
Is this, I mean, if we're heading towards that, and I think there are risks that we are heading towards that, in order not to give the counter-revolution let's say a full flush in the game, and then they win it completely because they will say, okay, we are the only ones who can keep the order. It will be a blend of Hezbollah, the Ahad, the army, etc., regardless of details. If we don't want to get into that and to surrender to that at one point, the revolution and the revolt and the movement, the Hirak, call it as you wish, will have to start organizing. They cannot leave the political space for such a game.
Right.
Now, unless what we are seeing is the expression of the most powerful part of the street and the movement and the process, I don't think so. But if this is it, I think we are heading towards a very nasty set 3 or set 4, if we want to take the metaphor. You said that Lebanon is so far, God bless, not violent, will become at one point violent if we don't start to envisage that and confront it. I mean, of course, I don't buy at all the threat that, for example, the Minister of Foreign Affairs have expressed in Rome a few weeks ago, that we are heading towards Syria and etc. We are not. And this is where, if you notice, I said Arab Revolutions 2.0. These revolutions in Algeria, in Sudan, in Lebanon, in Iraq, and etc., are very much aware of the fact that you have to stick very strongly to non-violence.
Right.
But at some point, violence is not, or non-violence is not your only choice. It can be the choice that someone is infringing on you, that the power is obliging you to confront, like in Syria at one point, for example, in the beginning. So if we want to avoid that, and if we want to avoid being taken over, I mean the movement being taken over by the radical factions that we are starting to see the shades of in some banks and in some incidents and etc. Also, there is a need to start, let's say, organizing, strategizing, thematizing, and etc. even though, and I'll be cynical here, and I don't like what I'm saying, even though sometimes you can make good use of certain levels of violence just to show your adversary that you're not completely someone you can, easily sweep away, but you can't go all the way in this game because you're not the strongest party in that.
So in other words, the situation is fluid enough where you could see a degeneration. In other words, there is no guarantee that this will remain a peaceful, non-violent
Sure, there's no guarantee.
There's no guarantee.
This is why the only guarantee that we can have are the guarantees that we are giving to ourselves by building the movement.
Right.
By strategizing, by starting to think ahead, by starting to say, okay, this will collapse. You refer to the group that we have gathered to write this paper and etc. And you said we are working on a new paper.
Yeah.
Let me give you a scoop about, the pitch of this new paper. The pitch will be the following. The system is collapsing. There's no way out of it. But after the collapse, any country, and Lebanon in particular, has the choice either to continue on the downward slope and collapse completely, and then you take the examples you want, Congo, Venezuela, Colombia, whatever. Or you can say, okay, fine, there are certain countries that collapsed and then who bounced back, like Portugal, Greece, etc., etc. So we are not
story of austerity.
Exactly, and we are not doomed for one or the other. But the choice between one or another will be very much predicated and function of what we do today politically and economically in terms of organization. If we don't strategize and organize, the collapse will lead us to an endless downward slope and we'll reach the bottom. If we start to strategize, at one point the collapse will give us, on the contrary, the sufficient tools for rebounds, because the political class and the dominant class will be swept away by the collapse, provided we are organized to replace it. But if we are not, nothing will replace the order that is today.
The sincere efforts that you and a dozen or so intellects, academics, and thinkers put towards that emergency rescue plan, did anyone in a position of power in this country take you seriously?
To my knowledge, no. And this is why I'm confident that this power structure is dead and over. It is comatose.
I've been suggesting this recently to just friends and conversations that Lebanon, quote unquote, the Lebanon I know, the Lebanon you know, died on October 17th.
I think so.
And I think you're saying it in a way that we don't know whether something better or worse will come in the near future, but the old order is gone.
This is exactly my mindset, if I may say personally, and I think the mindset of a lot of people who are saying, okay, it's dead anyway, now we have to do something to replace it. We don't know what will be the replacement, but something is open. This is why I'm very much optimistic, like others, that something has been opened, but I'm afraid also and cautious and sometimes pessimistic, because if we don't know how to do and what to do instead of what is dying, we can stay in a situation of limbo that is very long and very complicated and very lethal also. So and I will say something provocative, Ronnie. Because of that, because the system is dead and we have to do something to replace it, if you really are in the same position and hoping for a better future, we should bet on the failure of this government that is failing, that is forming. People should not support this government, probably. If you are on the protest side, you should say, these people have to fail completely because we have to bury the cadaver. And the burying of the cadaver will be the death of this government. So we have to go to the end of the cycle in order to start replacing. What I'm saying is not nihilistic or dangerous or aggressive. This is the dynamics that has to completely take its way in order for us to replace it. You can't do something new with old. You can't do new wine with old bottles, as they say.
But it is quite telling that many citizens without political clout read that paper and thought through it, and they argued it and
No, we had a fair amount of discussion,
Yes,
debate
and
with people,
sure,
with experts,
but
and
it is
etc.
quite
But in
tragic.
the political class, no
Yeah.
one, to my knowledge, called and said, "Okay, let's discuss this. It's
Right.
interesting. Maybe you can provide us the skeleton of this as an advice for the new government, and etc." We haven't seen that.
So this second potential paper that will be released, is the intended audience meant to build on those that read the first one, and perhaps a future political class that is not there yet?
Yeah. I think I told you about the pitch of it. I think the idea will be to say, look, the collapse is inevitable,
Yeah.
but after the collapse, we can choose to completely die or we can choose to rebirth.
So the audience wouldn't be necessarily for the ruling elite.
No, it
for
will.
now. Yeah.
I hope it will be the start of, or a very small stone in the edifice of starting to structure
Yeah.
and strategize the protest and the movement in order to prepare for the Lebanon that will inevitably come to life again after the complete death of this structure.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that all the political figures will disappear. Of course not. I'm not stupid, and this is not. I mean, in terms of political science, it never happens.
Yeah.
But the system, the way of doing things, the political culture, the economic choices. For example, this rentier system that we are living on for decades, even before the war, has to end. And this is what we have to prepare.
Yeah.
And to prepare it, you can't keep alive bits and pieces of the old system, because these bits and pieces are completely polluted. You can't put them into the new puzzle. It doesn't work.
They're beyond their expiration date.
Exactly.
That's true.
Exactly.
I want
now, certain figures will be, of course, will be redeemed. They will redeem themselves, and this is normal, and it is wanted, because not everyone is
Right.
to be thrown away. But the system, as a systemic construction, will have to be. I think, get over.
One that encourages good governance as opposed to encourages poor, corrupt, crony capitalism. And,
Partially.
Partially.
Yeah, and other things.
And
also.
other things. I want to end this by asking you a more personal story that has to do more with a fellow writer that I admire and you worked with, Samir Asir. Can you tell me a bit about his views leading up to the 2005 protests? Not necessarily the disillusionment with what happened after March 14, and of course culminating in his horrible ending. I'm talking more about the way he saw the average protester and the role of the citizen. And I think you mentioned this, you touched on it, which is the real issues that matter. Less the geopolitics, more just the domestic accountability and all that. I've interviewed Giselle Khouri, Ziad Majid. I've learned a lot from Malik Mroui. Voices that all knew him as a friend and a colleague. Just, would he be happy with what's happening now? And I mean this on the lowest level, the street level, the protest.
This is undoubtable. I mean, Samir would have been ecstatic today with what's happening. But let me tell you what your question puts me again back to what I was saying before. I mean, this oscillation between the macro-political and the micro-political and the political and the economic and this. Just a personal, and it's the first time I say that publicly. We were three very good friends with Samir, a third person, and I. And we had a very heated debate that ended in a sort of dispute about one point. It was in 97, 98, before the election of Emile Lahoud to presidency.
Yes.
We were already, and you can, I mean, all of you and the listeners can go back to the Orient Express and look at the archives. We were very much against the Hariri political economy system, the corruption then already,
Was
and
this
etc.
in Beirut or in Paris?
In Beirut. And we
okay.
were sitting in a house in Ashafiyeh. And the debate was, should we today give the priority to fighting the corruption of the political economic system that Hariri has put in place, or we should give priority to the sovereignty and the freedom of the country against the Syrians? And at one point, of course, we knew that both factors were intertwined and completely feeding each other.
Yeah.
And I won't tell you what was the conclusion of the debate, but the mere fact that we had this debate and we were very staunchly opposed on what should we confront first in priority. My feeling is that today what's happening is a marriage of the two issues. And this is why I think Samir would have been very happy, because today you are not anymore forced to choose to fight this or that exclusively. Because you know that today fighting both is exactly what you have to do, because if not, you are losing the battle.
Right.
So, and this is where I'm saying that even though you are confronted today, we are concentrated today on the day-to-day issues, on the microeconomic or the corruption, governance, and etc. You can't forget about the importance of talking of the political system as such. Now, of course, there's the regional question that is something else that can engulf you in something else. Yeah. But this is where I think the importance of what's happening since October 17 is that it is marrying and blending things that are macro-political, micro-political, macroeconomic, microeconomic, day-to-day, citizenship, environment, I mean, all the themes that were left aside or tackled partially and sectorially so far. Yeah. This is the first time that you have a kind of, let's say, synthesis of all this together. And this is why, if we don't seize that moment and start to put it in a political framework, we would have lost this momentum. Yeah. And Samir definitely would have said, guys, this is your moment. This is the moment you have to seize. Definitely, because now you can talk about everything together.
Right. And it's hard to argue against that, because if you're able to bring up all the flaws at once, I think that's the magic of the moment, that you are unified in your collective outrage of how this country has worked or not worked. And I think there is hope there. And I try to read into his older writings now, and I sense that he touched on all these issues in equal measure, but at the end of the day, you need a domestic accountability to maybe see through all the mess. And I don't know if I got that right at the end, but it seems like people on the streets, especially in Martyrs Square, saying "Killun yani killun" is really just, I can hear Samir Asir writing that.
He could have invented this slogan. Yeah. You said a word that is, I think, very important, the magic. I mean, without being over romantic or over rosy, but anyone who was in the streets of Beirut during these last weeks couldn't but see the magic of certain moments, of certain aspects. Even in 2005, I was there partially because then I left for Paris, but there was something lacking. There was something very moving, but there was something lacking. And what was lacking was probably the day-to-day thing. I mean, we were talking about big issues. Yeah. We're not talking about our small issues. Today we are talking about both. Yes. And this is why probably the magic is there. Yeah. And maybe, I mean, once again in this interview, let's not give a chance for that to wither away and slip from our hands, because it won't be replicated easily again.
I completely agree. I sense that good and bad things are going to happen. I hope more good than bad for the time being. And I really appreciate your time.
Inshallah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joseph.
Thank you.